Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast. I'm your host, Jeongmin Kim, the editorial director of Korea Pro.
And I'm John Lee, the editor of Korea Pro.
Join us for a weekly 15-minute conversation as we dive into the most pressing stories shaping South Korea and dissect the most complicated ones for you.
From politics to culture, technology to society, we've got you covered. So stay ahead of the curve and never be sidelined again.
So get ready for a fresh perspective on South Korea's news. This is the Korea Pro podcast.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, or whatever time that it is that you're listening to us right now. It is the Korea Pro podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, John Lee, and you are?
Jeongmin.
Okay, and we are recording on Wednesday. It's about 3:30 p.m. today. We are recording a day earlier than usual, but there has been a lot of news coverage going on. The South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol went on TV and gave the very first briefing since
Policy announcement briefing
since he became president, and he talked about yummy oil. Apparently,
next to a map
of the Korean Peninsula, right off of Pohang, and he said that about billions of barrels of oil are potentially underground within the seabed. So, Jeongmin, you just wrote this wonderful analysis that I have to start editing soon after we finish recording this. Could you tell our listeners and our viewers as to what this whole thing is about?
Well, it was actually the optics first. And we never, like you mentioned, that we never seen this sort of briefing from Yoon Suk-yeol before. He stood next to a map. And apparently this was quite rushed and it was a surprise briefing. So the presidential office press corps didn't even know about this briefing going on.
Apparently it even took the Ministry of Energy by surprise.
Yeah, so I heard that the Ministry of Energy, when asked by reporters what's going on, they were like, oh, we're figuring it out. So it seems like, although reportedly this was a classified project named Blue Whale, 대왕고래, for a year, the announcement itself was quite out of the blue. These are the mining areas Block 8 and Block 6-1 in the East Sea, and this is different from the Block 7 in the past, which is more famous in South Korea for the Park Chung-hee era sort of.
And what are these different blocks?
Right, the blocks are considered the regions that, it's basically classified into different regions that South Korea can sort of look into within the territorial waters.
Part of South Korea's exclusive economic zone, of
right,
course.
Right. But then Block 7 that South Korea and Japan did like a joint development before, or not developed it before because Japan wasn't that interested anymore. This was more controversial because of the location. This sort of overlaps with the region where China also thinks that it's its territorial waters. So that was like a bit more difficult and complicated.
But we have to mention that Block 7 is not where the oil supposedly is located.
Right, so that's why Japan wasn't interested anymore. But Block 8 and Block 6-1, these are the areas where South Koreans, and with the allegedly help from Act-Geo, a company based in Texas.
Apparently his CEO is Brazilian, I think. His name is Vitor Abreu.
With
I
40
probably
years
got that
experience.
name wrong. I'm sorry about that.
They conducted the geological survey and they found that there might be 25% oil and 75% natural gas in that region. But grain of salt, because this is before drilling. This is just geological survey looking at the general signs of potential reservoir. So we have to keep an eye on what the actual drilling, exploration drilling result might be.
And we have to mention that Dr. Abreu, I'm assuming that he's a professor, that he is in Korea right now, and he's going to meet with the ministry officials as well as gas companies, and he's going to discuss this further. But it seems that there's a whole lot more that are known right now.
And also there was a tone difference between the president and the industries minister, An Deok-keun, during the briefing. They both cited very high possibility of deposits between 3.5 to 14 billion barrels. That's actually a lot of gap of oil and gas, and stating that the amount sort of is enough to meet the demands of gas demands for around 30 years and oil demands for around 4 years. So if this is true, it could be a game changer, at least for around quarter of a century for the industries here that are very oil and gas dependent, right?
Right, it would be. But the thing is, again, you just said that there was a very different tone between the president and the Ministry of Trade. The president seemed to be very excited about this, and I assume that's understandable. His popularity rating tanked 21% now, his approval rating. And I'm sure that he was looking forward to some sort of an approval bump from this. But the ministry themselves, they seem to be rather cautious about this announcement.
Right. It's sort of reading between the lines. It sounded like the ministry did not really want this information to get out into the public until it is verified a little more. And also, when I talk to experts, it's quite rare for a president level to announce something that has not, about a project that hasn't even done a exploration drilling yet.
This is starting to remind me of Busan all over again.
Yeah. Busan Expo, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Where we are talking about, yes, Busan is good, and all of those campaigning just starting before anything could even happen. And it seems like that's playing out again.
So this is, like, just strategy-wise, this might have been not the smartest one so far, because also it comes with a lot of risks, and very tangible risks as well that we are already seeing. Stock prices related to oil industry and drilling and exploration.
S-oil, coal
shot
gas.
up.
Yeah.
And immediately, just right after the presidential briefing.
I think S-oil's stocks went up by 12%, if I'm not mistaken. So that's quite the bump.
So one of the top significant risks that comes from this is unclear level of certainty of the information that's coming out, while it might lead to economic bubble. Sort of similar to what we saw back in the days when Park Chung-hee announced something similar right after the oil shock.
And this was back in 1976. So this is the first time that a president has gone up on camera, live TV, and talked about an oil potential discovery since 1976. So again, there's going to be comparisons between him and Park Chung-hee, and in South Korea, you really don't want to be compared to Park Chung-hee, especially if you, I suppose, depending on the demographics and the voter base. But yeah, it's still going to cause a lot of people, whether we talk about those on the left or those in the middle, to start to get a little bit, they're going to want to scratch that itch.
I must also point out, though, that although the probability is very low, also 20% is not like a set probability, because it could be very easily just very underwhelming compared to 20% even, right?
Right. It could be less, it could be more.
Right.
We just don't know.
We just don't know, and we have to wait and see. But I have to point out that this was an ongoing project in South Korea, not just for oil and gas, according to experts. I thought this was like a government sort of talking point, but then from geologists' perspective, this actually opens up other researches if they actually put government money investment into that. For example, this comes with environmental risks, of course, because it's a pursuit of fossil fuel, basically.
Sure.
It could tarnish South Korea's international image a little bit, but then South Korea was already sort of suffering, meeting the international demands like the 100% renewable energy or net zero for 2050.
And we have been importing oil and gas for decades at this point. So we are one of the highest consumers of oil and gas. It actually
shot up. Between 2000 and 2022, the crude oil dependency actually doubled.
Well, especially with all of our heavy industry, semiconductors, that's completely understandable.
So it's like it's a reality that we need this energy for now, at least until we actually transition.
But let's circle back to what you just said. You said that even if there's no oil discovered, there could be other benefits. What are those other benefits?
Right, like when it comes to carbon emission related issues, some experts actually pointed to the possibility of not just finding oil or not finding oil through these explorations in the East Sea, not just Block 8 or 6-1, regardless of the drilling results. Even when there is no oil found, if they found something like water-filled reservoirs, South Korea could very easily use that in the future when there's an urgent need to cut the carbon emission to meet the cap. They can actually store it in the water-filled reservoirs, which has been something...
Store carbon underground beneath the seabed. Okay, all right.
So that is an option. So it seems that, first of all, petrogeologists are very excited to hear this news, although they are skeptical of the probability. But still, they are emphasizing that there needs to be more awareness of how, despite these potential risks, it is worth looking into it.
Okay, but... although there's a whole lot that we do not know, how much oil there is, how much benefits there's going to be, what we do know is the cost. How much it's going to cost to actually drill for one of these holes.
Okay, this is an estimation from the government, and I must say this is a very conservative calculation based on the premise that first 5 drilling will be successful, which is 500 billion Korean won, sort of around 364 million USD.
Okay, so that's quite the penny.
This is under the premise that they just do it 5 times.
Okay.
Because it's 20%.
Right.
Right?
So here's my question now. We wouldn't be doing our jobs if we did not take the worst case potential scenario into account. If they spend all this money trying to see if there's oil and gas in there, and they find nothing, what's going to happen? I'm assuming that by this point, Yoon will no longer be in office, right?
Yeah.
Or will he still be in office by that point?
Probably not in office, considering how sometimes these take years, and also considering this is the deep sea, not compared to, it's different from 2004 Donghae gas reservoir, which was much shallower water. So this is
Okay.
very different. This will be more tricky.
Okay.
So there is actually a high possibility that when time comes, someone has to take responsibility for spending money and not really gaining much. He might not be in office.
So it's not a whole lot of personal risk for the president, I suppose.
So I see why he wanted to announce it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to the next topic now. Domestic politics. There's been quite the movement in the National Assembly lately, and one of the names that I've heard quite repeated often is Won-sik. Now, please tell us why his name keeps popping up.
But Won-sik is now officially, as of Wednesday, elected as a Speaker of the National Assembly for the first half of the term for the 22nd National Assembly.
Not Chumie.
Not Chumie, but we mentioned that so many times before.
No need to rehash it.
Yeah,
now.
so let's move on. So he is elected and he will start his term. And also deputy speakers are elected. And now the next tension will be in who heads the committees.
Right.
And the deadline for that is June 7th.
And so there's been quite the movement toward finding a lot of these committees that they want to lead. And of course, the legislative committee is the one that's the hottest right now.
Right, that's the most popular one because they are probably also imagining something like the special investigations sort of dominating the news cycle for the first half of the term.
Special investigations into everything, whether it's the marine death, the First Lady, Itaewon, anything that they can just get their hands on, right?
Right, so they will. They are supposed to wrap it up, the competition up by sort of like end of this week, but then usually it passes the deadline. So it will probably take maybe a week or 2 more until we see who goes to which committee. So keep an eye on that.
Unlock the full Korea Pro experience by joining our community. Stay informed, stay ahead, and never miss a beat on Korean affairs that matter. Subscribe today and transform the way you understand Korea.
Next topic, foreign policy. There were a few minor tension related to history and whatnot.
Recent history.
Recent history as well. Let's start with Japan.
Right.
There was this whole article, bunch of South Korean articles that picked up Japanese articles that sort of painted different pictures considering about the same incident.
Okay, so we have to talk about this and provide a little bit more context. So in Singapore, they just had the Shangri-La Dialogue. And the annual Shangri-La Dialogue. Now, we'll talk about this in more depth later, but one of the sideline discussions was between South Korea and Japan, and the discussion was about the radar lock incident that happened a few years ago. For those of you who are not familiar with it, a South Korean destroyer was off in the East Sea during rescue operations, or looking for North Korean defectors who were afloat or something. But at the time, a Japanese patrol plane was also nearby, and the Japanese government has claimed that the South Korean Navy, the South Korean destroyer, had locked on that plane with its radar, which is one step before actually firing upon it. And this has caused a lot of tensions between Japan and South Korea for years. And finally, during this recent discussions, they decided to just bury the past and take steps to ensure that this sort of thing does not happen again going forward.
Right, they did like a joint statement between the defense ministers of Japan and South Korea for this, right? Including this. Now, that's the good news. But what's going on was that the Yomiuri Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper, they claimed that the Japanese government had also said to the South Korean side, hey, we also want to talk about one other thing, and that's the flag. And not the Japanese flag exactly, but it's the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force's symbol, which known as Rising Sun.
Well, it's not exactly the same flag as a Japanese Rising Sun flag from the World War II, but it is very similar.
Reminiscent of it, right?
Yeah. And so I believe this is in 2018. There was an international naval drill that Japan eventually decided to withdraw from because South Korea at the time, under the Moon Jae-in government, said they cannot participate with that flag. And now, apparently, with this recent discussion, the Japanese government was saying, we want you to allow us to use this flag and to recognize it in any future joint naval drills.
Why do they want it anyways?
Well, it's their symbol, and they don't want to give up on it. Okay, so we have to talk about this particular flag. From South Korea's perspective, this flag is almost the same thing as the swastika. It was the flag that Imperial Japan had used during its conquest of Korea, China, the rest of Asia. And so in South Korea, that flag is seen as a symbol of oppression, colonialism. And so South Korea really has a guttural instinct whenever we see that flag.
There's a Korean term for that, 발작 버튼.
Right. But of course, in Japan, that flag goes way beyond World War II. That flag was used for much longer. And so from the Japanese side, it's saying, this is our tradition. This is our symbolic, this is our traditional symbol. And therefore, we cannot just agree to get rid of it just for South Korea.
So, okay, circling back to South Korean reaction, Yomiuri and Hangyeore, they painted very different picture of how South Korea responded.
Right.
How was it different?
So in Hangyeore, they were saying, how much did they just think that we were pushovers, that they would actually dare to broach this topic? Yoon has had this very pro-Japan foreign policy. Some would say subservient. The Democratic Party certainly has used that word many times. And so Hangyeore, being a left-leaning newspaper, very critical of the president, was saying it's because of the president's foreign policy that the Japanese government was able to look down on Korea and say, hey, we have this one other demand. But Yomiuri was saying something a little bit more different. Yomiuri was saying that, okay, the Japanese side did bring this up, but then the South Korean side hardened their position and said that, hey, if you are going to insist upon this, then we are willing to forego this agreement. And so the Japanese side eventually withdrew that demand. And so it became a cordial agreement to ensure that the two militaries will be able to cooperate again without having to broach that topic of that flag. And so because of this particular flag, there's been quite an issue going on within both countries right now.
Week ahead, there were a few more things that were announced during the Shangri-La dialogue, especially between South Korea, US, and Japan, including a new type of trilateral drill, Freedom Edge.
It's going to apparently incorporate bilateral military exercises that the U.S. had with South Korea and with Japan, and they're going to combine the two.
Hence the name, Freedom
Edge. Apparently, it's going to include cyber operations, naval operations, aerial, land, everything.
And apparently, this is set for mid-June, I believe. But in the next week or so, let's keep an eye on more details.
Right.
Moving on to the next foreign policy news, South Korea started its rotational role chairing the UN Security Council, UNSC. This is quite symbolic because just symbolic, or mostly
it's only for 1 month.
Right, it's for 1 month, and also regardless of whether or not you are a chair, you don't get to have veto power anyways. But still,
that's just for the P5 members.
Right. But still, it gives South Korea both responsibility and pressure to lead the discussion topic in the room, basically.
So all the pressure, but none of the power. That's great.
Yeah, but then my concern about this rotational role for June for South Korea is that, remember that South Korea coined this term, global pivotal state? It was supposed to be something that directs South Korea away from focusing just on North Korea issues and sort of putting it under general security threat in the region and being a more internationally influential power, a middle power in the region, basically. But then I think because of recent news development, or maybe not even because of that, I think South Korea will be using this role just to mention whole lot of North Korea issues and then gather a lot of meetings about that.
Well, South Korea can say that they're a global pivotal state, but, not act like one, which has really been the modus operandi for the past couple of years anyway.
Right. If they are really sticking to this global pivotal state role as a UN Security Council chair, people will probably expect South Korea to bring up and address other security crisis in other parts of the region, right?
Do they really expect South Korea to do that, though?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
Next in line, Africa Summit ended this week, and there was an Africa-South Korea Business Summit today, I believe, right?
Yeah. Now, this was quite massive. 48 African countries visited, delegates have
And a
visited
whole lot
South
of
Korea.
bilateral summits as well.
There were bilateral summits, and Yoon was talking about how he's going to increase South Korea's investments into African countries, also increase the ODA,
Right.
the official development assistance.
Which was our executive briefing this morning. And South Korea and the visiting African delegations also agreed to create this new core mineral supply chain sort of dialogue, right?
Now, that is a good thing, of course, because South Korea requires a lot of these critical minerals to
And
actually
diversification of supply chain.
Right, they need it for the semiconductor sector, and they need it to diversify it away from China. But the question is, will it be all that helpful? Because a lot of these African countries have already had a lot of bilateral trade deals with, China, Japan, the U.S. A lot of these foreign companies have already invested and been present in the African continent for a long time. South Korea is just the latest kid on the block. Will South Korea be able to reap the benefits that it wants from all of these deals? That's the thing that we have to look out for.
Right. I guess the logic from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs South Korea is that it's better to at least start late than not starting at all.
I suppose.
Lastly, a National Assembly, because it formally started this week, you will hear a lot of noise with, lawmakers getting their first bill out.
Tabling their bills and everything.
Right. But mostly their first bills are symbolic ones that show their direction for the next 4 years.
Right. They want to show that they're being serious.
Right. So if there is anything that is actually of big importance, we will write it in the executive briefing for you. So check it out.
And the week ahead newsletters will be in your email inboxes every Monday by 2 o'clock. So please subscribe if you want to know more.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why they matter every morning in your inboxes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for your weekly dose of insight. And until next time, I'm Jeongmin Kim.
And I'm John Lay. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the Great Pro Podcast.